Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Mehdi Hasan. He is the host of the Mehdi Hasan Show on MSNBC and Peacock. He's also the author of the new book, Win Every Argument, The Art of Debating, Persuading, and Public Speaking. Mehdi Hasan, welcome back to Current Affairs.
Thanks for having me on, Nathan.
Okay, so you are infamous for your interviews. You are known as the most terrifying interrogator in the business. You have gone up against such odious people. That's my characterization, not yours, as John Bolton, Steven Pinker, Eric Prince of Blackwater, Paul Bremer, and, oh my God, Douglas Murray.
My sins.
I guess the first question is, why argue with these people at all?
It's a good question. I don't argue with everyone. I should put that out there right at the beginning. I know the book's called Win Every Argument. I'm not actually telling people to go out and have every argument possible. There are many arguments I walk away from. There are many interviews I don't do. I would not do an interview, I've said this before, I'll say it again, with a Marjorie Taylor Greene, with a person who's pushing QAnon conspiracies or election denialism or climate change denial. It's not worth it. I'm not going to debate reality. But what I would say is that, for example, John Bolton is an interesting one. We're about to mark the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. He is someone who still believes in the Iraq War. I don't think he's a Tucker Carlson figure who's texting in private the opposite of what he's saying in public. I think he genuinely thinks the Iraq War was great, and he stands by it in good faith, if you can use that phrase about the Iraq War. So when I had him on my show a couple of years ago, I pushed him on the Iraq War. Do the deaths not weigh on his conscience? I believe there were questions that were worth asking that other people hadn't asked him. And really, some of these people who you describe as odious, their views certainly are odious in many cases, even in my view. But I want to challenge them, right? And I believe that in our industry, there hasn't been enough challenging being done. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because I want people to be more combative and challenging and confrontational, not just in the media business, but across the board. So when I see an Eric Prince or a John Bolton, I see people who need to be held to account. And I feel like I can ask some questions which might help us do that.
Yeah. But someone like John Bolton is a slippery customer, right? So when you said to him, don't the deaths weigh on your conscience? He says, well, I want to draw a distinction between removing Saddam and then everything that came after it. And all the bad things are mismanagement afterwards, but that doesn't in any way affect the legitimacy of the underlying decision to invade and depose Saddam.
Yeah, and if you watch that clip...
So what do you do?
You got to push back, right? This is one of the things. Unfortunately, too many interviewers at that point will either nod and move on to the next topic or not forensically go back enough, strongly enough. So what I do is I try and have the follow-up questions. I mean, something that's a lost art in some parts of our media industry is the follow-up question. There's no point just asking one question about something important and then not having a bunch of follow-ups to say, but hold on, what you're saying there is inaccurate, or hold on, have you considered this statistical fact? And when Bolton tried to make that disingenuous, nonsensical split between the invasion and the rest of the war, the occupation, I didn't let him do that.
Yeah, the classic, obviously, probably the most infamous example of the follow-up question is that Jeremy Paxman interview where he's asking the guy whether he threatened to overrule the other guy, and he asked the question about 17 times.
The prison governor, I think he asked it 13 times. Or
13 times. I don't know that you've ever done a question quite that many. I don't know if you've beaten Paxman's record.
Actually, I've come close. Paxman was a hero of mine growing up. I urge your readers and listeners to go look up Jeremy Paxman clips on YouTube, notorious BBC interrogator. Yeah. And he did ask a conservative minister once the same question 13 times. Although, interestingly, Nathan, later on it turned out that it wasn't some act of journalistic brilliance. The next package had fallen through. There was a technical issue and they told him to buy time. So he just asked the same question and again. I did something similar, not for that cynical a reason, with the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister, Zippy Hotovely, on my Al Jazeera English show a few years ago, where I simply asked her, do you support a two-state solution? Which I knew she didn't. But I knew she couldn't say she didn't because she was bound by collective responsibility. She was in a cabinet that claimed to support a two-state solution. So she kept saying, the government I'm part of supports a two-state solution. And I kept saying, but what about you? What about you? And she said, Mehdi, you could ask me that 10 times. I'll give you the same answer. But I kept asking it because it was worth doing.
Literally yesterday in an interview, I learned from you and from an example you cite in your book, I think of Elizabeth Warren going after Michael Bloomberg about non-disclosure agreements, because I had Marianne Williamson on the program. There had just been a report that she had bound workers to non-disclosure agreements and had covered up abusive management practices in the workplace. And I asked her, would you hold people to non-disclosure agreements if they tried to go public with these accusations? And she replied, I'm not Donald Trump. But of course, that's not an answer, right?
Oh.
So I followed up and I was like, but would you? And I was like, I am channeling my inner Mehdi Hasan here.
That Elizabeth Warren clip, by the way, is a great clip. It's a reminder of what you can do in a short space of time. In 59 seconds, she single-handedly destroyed Michael Bloomberg's presidential campaign on the debate stage in Las Vegas at that Democratic presidential debate. It was a masterpiece, to the point where Wikipedia amended its entry for Bloomberg that night to say murdered, killed by Elizabeth Warren, time of death, whatever it was in Las Vegas.
Well, I mean, that's actually a really interesting example, because I think one of the questions people might have when they crack open your book is kind of where I began at the beginning, which is, what's the point, right? So you win an argument. Okay, good for you. You won the argument. You feel good, but you haven't gotten anything. You haven't moved political power. But that is, in fact, a case where, Michael Bloomberg, there was a lot of buzz around him until that moment.
100%. People forget that he was starting to poll very highly in places like Florida. I think he was already third in the national buzz. I can't remember the exact position, but he had a lot of momentum and buzz. There were a lot of centrists in the party who saw him as a better version of Biden, a better centrist candidate than Biden. He had a lot of money. And she literally, within a few weeks, he was out of the race. And that can be the power of rhetoric. Obviously not every time, obviously not across the board, and no one's pretending that rhetoric has that power in every instance. But there are moments. I look at Eric Prince as an example, where I interviewed Eric Prince, and it wasn't just, he won the argument and it was fun and the audience in the Oxford Union laughed and applauded when I cornered him on his, dishonest testimony to Congress. Adam Schiff ends up referring him to the Department of Justice after my interview with Eric Prince for possible perjury, which is still an unresolved case to this day. So, there is an impact you can have with certain moments, and not just interviews, debates, arguments, personal interaction. Everyone watching, reading, listening to this conversation of ours, Nathan, will have an instance from their life where they had a discussion or a debate or argument which had consequences, major consequences, maybe life-changing consequences. People say, arguments, some people like arguing, what's the point? I say it depends how you define it. I define an argument very broadly. I would say when you go for a job interview, you're making an argument for yourself. You're making the case for yourself. And no one would say that's a trivial thing to do. You may need to have to pay your mortgage or your rent, and you need that job. Well, I'm saying in the book, here's the best way to get that job. Here's the best way to negotiate that pay rise.
Yeah, because I recently published a book of responses to right-wing arguments, and I got a very negative review, actually, in Compact magazine. The headline is "The Left's Debate Bro." Maybe you've had this name applied to you before, Debate Bro. And the argument that was made in the review was, why do you respond to all these terrible right-wing arguments? Politics is about building power, and you're talking about winning the discourse.
What a load of utopian BS is what I say to whoever wrote that.
Okay.
Most of the kind of queries or pushbacks that I've gotten from this book are from well-meaning people who want to live in a world of kumbaya and say, well, why shouldn't we be finding... I was in the UK and an interviewer said, I feel nervous about your book in this polarized climate. Should we be increasing polarization? Polarization is not increased because more people are having arguments. What I'm trying to say is the arguments are already happening. Are you winning or losing them? Are you able to convince the people in the middle, the kind of sometimes imaginary independent voter, sometimes crucial independent swing voter? I found like a lot of the people who push back against debate, argument, rhetoric are people who want to live in a world other than the world that we actually inhabit. My book is a very practical book. It's about the real world. I even say, don't use some of the techniques and tricks that I deploy. Don't use them in high school debate competitions. You'll lose. You'll be penalized. You're not supposed to do that. High school debate competitions, very formal, very lots of rules. I'm saying they're for the real world. Therefore, when you're actually up against someone on a platform, in a boardroom, in a negotiation. And, human nature is such, Nathan, you know better than me, that you have to deal with human nature as it is, not in some abstract, idealized view. Sure. And just to come back to your point, your book is an essential book. It's a book I actually wanted to write. I was going to shout at you, Nathan, and say you beat me to it. I wanted to write a book responding to right-wing arguments. That was probably going to be my next book. You probably stole.
I wanted to write your book, so we're even.
There you go then. So you write a better version of my one, and I'll write a lesser version of yours. But, this Michelle Obama idea that when they go high, we go low is one of the most pernicious. And I'm saying this as a fan of Michelle Obama. I have a great soft spot for Michelle Obama.
Yeah, that quote grates on me too.
But when they go low, we go high.
Yeah.
It's absolutely damaging to the progressive cause, because right now all they're doing is going low, and going high doesn't get you anywhere. Going high allows Donald Trump to be the front runner in the Republican Party's presidential campaign right now.
Yeah.
Over 2 years after he incited an armed insurrection, the man is running for president again. We're speaking on a day where he may get indicted any moment over the Stormy Daniels stuff, but he's running for president again despite a coup, despite an insurrection, because Democrats said, let's go high.
Yeah.
Let's take our time. Let's build bipartisan support. Let's get a special counsel to slow everything down. And I feel like that's a real problem in an age of gaslighters, in an age of authoritarians, in an age of what I call gish gallopers in the book. You cannot just go high and imagine moral high ground while your opponents, meanwhile, are winning the argument.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned gish galloping, which is this technique of just saying a bunch of false things in a row. So Ben Shapiro has made this his entire career, right? You speak really fast, and then people can't refute you as fast as you can drop fallacies. But you're talking there about why we need to learn these techniques. It reminded me of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, where Democrats interrogated Brett Kavanaugh. I wrote a whole 10,000-word article at the time laying out all of the proof that Kavanaugh was lying in his testimony. But Democrats, he slipped through their grasp. And I feel as if they had read your book and they had followed up, and I was like, no, you've got to say, this contradicts your testimony. Your calendar shows that this could have happened, and you're saying it didn't happen. And they didn't do it, and now he's on the Supreme Court.
So it's interesting you picked the Kavanaugh example, because the Kavanaugh example is where clearly some Democrats dropped the ball. I'm not sure all of them did. I've been critical of Kamala Harris, but I thought she did very well, if you remember, during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, as did Amy Klobuchar, if memory serves me correctly. I would give a different example to you, Nathan. Okay. I would give the example of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's hearings, where Republicans are basically child porn, you're soft on child porn, you're soft on child sex predators. And the Democrats, with the exception of Cory Booker, do not blow up over this. They don't blow up. And what I say in chapter 2 of the book is, you need some emotion, you need some feeling. It's not enough just to have evidence. It's not enough and your 10,000-word article, I'm sure, is brilliant. It's not enough to have forensic evidence of a lie or a contradiction. At certain times, you need a bit of moral outrage. You need a bit of how dare you, sir. Cory Booker did it very well during those hearings. I would have liked to see Democrats across the board, number one, get way more emotional about this black woman being smeared as she's in the middle of being confirmed. I would also like them to see ad hominem attacks. I write a chapter in the book defending ad hominem attacks.
Defensive ad hominems, yes.
Nathan, if I was a Democratic senator sitting in that Judiciary Committee, I would have sat and I would have said, you know what? You want to talk about sex predators? Let's talk about sex predators. Let's talk about Denny Hastert. Let's talk about the allegations against Donald Trump and Jim Jordan. Let's go through the entire record of Republicans who've been accused of this stuff, or prosecuted in the case of Hastert. But they didn't do it.
All right. When you say, though, that you don't like Michelle Obama's when they go low, we go high, aren't you there suggesting that in order to beat the Republicans, we have to become like the Republicans, and we have to resort to the kind of dirty tricks and become just as bad as they are?
Well, it's a bit of a loaded question, Nathan, because, for example, what do you define as a dirty trick? Give me an example.
An ad hominem. This is getting away from the arguments, it's talking about people.
So something else I do in the book is always question the premise of your opponent. I don't accept your premise that ad hominem is a dirty trick. I believe that ad hominem arguments are legitimate tools when deployed in legitimate ways. Like any other rhetorical tool, it can be deployed in a good way or a bad way. It can be deployed in a bad way by Donald Trump, who says, you're fat, you're ugly, I'll make a racial insult about you. I'm not defending that kind of ad hominem attack at all. But if you're saying, for example, the person sitting in front of me who says that climate change is a myth is funded by the fossil fuel industry, why would I not bring that up? Why would I not point that out? That is an ad hominem. It's a circumstantial ad hominem, to use a technical term, but it's very relevant, don't you think? That's not a dirty trick to say, hey, the person trying to persuade you that climate change is a myth, he has a financial self-interest in persuading you that it's a myth.
I assume he would reply to you and say, well, why don't you argue about the evidence I presented?
And I would say that we can argue about the evidence as well, but I'm not going to let you off the hook because you are pushing a case that has value to you, and the audience deserve to be skeptical of your arguments because you may not be making them in good faith. I've never said in the book I make it very clear. I don't say ad hominem arguments are argument winners. They're not the smoking gun. They're not the mic drop that allows you to win. And are they logical fallacies? Sometimes. Yes, sometimes not. What I am saying, though, is they should be used as part of a rhetorical toolkit to put your opponent on the defensive and to allow the audience to take a more skeptical stance towards your opponent's argument. Because again, Nathan, we don't live in some abstract utopia that the compact guy or Michelle Obama wants us to live in. We live in the real world. In the real world, human beings judge arguments not just on the basis of the arguments themselves, but on the people behind them, on the arguer. They do play the bull and the man. Mm-hmm. And fine, if you want to unilaterally disarm them, say, I will only high-mindedly address the premises and conclusions of your argument, while your opponent is busy building, saying, trust me, I'm a doctor, trust me, I'm a general. Building up their expertise. It's your job to do down that expertise and credibility, to question it at least, at the very minimum. By the way, Nathan, this is not a book about logic. It's a book about rhetoric. Rhetoric and logic are two different things.
Right. Well, logic is part of rhetoric, right? Isn't there the three-part thing with the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, and the logos is only part, but you've also got to get people to trust you?
Indeed. And I'm saying, look, this is what I say in the book in the chapter on ad hominems. I say at the end, if you are in a university seminar on logic, don't do this. It won't work. If you're in a high school debate, don't attack your opponent. You'll be penalized by the teacher. But in real life, if you're on a presidential debate platform and the man next to you is lying and has a history of lying, why wouldn't you say, hey, you're a liar?
I think friend of the program, Noam Chomsky, would be horrified by what you're saying. He's always had the position that rhetoric, there's almost something evil or sinister about rhetoric, and he has a very kind of dry, like, I'm going to just present the facts because that's all that's legitimate, is presenting facts.
And I just interviewed Noam Chomsky for my show this week on the Iraq anniversary, and he's still very lucid at the age of 94. His hearing's not as great as it was, but his memory is astonishingly good. And yeah, he's not someone known for just throwing out insults, and I'm not saying you should do that, but yes, I think he probably does take, as an academic, as an intellectual, he does take a probably more abstract approach to this stuff. I take the approach of someone who's spent my entire life both debating and arguing and interviewing politicians for a living. So yes, I'm going to have to live in the real world, and I won't apologize for that.
Yeah. Well, what about the the role of humility, right? So your book is Win Every Argument, but presumably it wouldn't be great if everyone read your book, right? Because if people like Douglas Murray and John Bolton pick up your book, they're going to develop tactics for becoming more effective. And to some people, we want to give them the ammunition to do better as they enter these conversations. Other people need kind of different advice, which is you shouldn't be trying to win every argument. You should be getting a little more pensive and self-reflective and thinking about your mistakes.
So I'd say three things, Nathan. Number one, my daughter, my 10-year-old, actually said to me, why did you write this book? Now your guests will all know what to do when you're interviewing them. Why did you give away your tricks? Which is a fair question. Maybe I'll regret it.
And you shouldn't give a copy to your daughter. Obviously, she should not be allowed to read it.
Children, spouses, it's a whole different ballgame. Congressman Ro Khanna made a joke on Twitter that he was going to read the book before he came on my show next time. Number two, I would say that, the people you talk about, the people we don't agree with or don't like, who you say shouldn't read the book, I mean, like with any other tool, it is a tool. It can be used for good or evil in anyone's hands. I don't dispute that. But number three, here's the really important point, Nathan, especially for your readers on the left. The people on the right are already doing this stuff. The people on the right are already winning. This is my problem. I believe that the right is better at this stuff. They are better at connecting with people's emotions. They are better at rousing up their base. They are better at connecting with human nature as it is, not as we want it to be. And I'm not saying, to go back to your earlier question, we should be more Republican. No, I'm not saying go out and be like Donald Trump and connect with people's fear and hate and anger and self-loathing. I'm saying connect with people's hopes and dreams, inspire them, use a case for solidarity. But the point is, appeal to people's emotions. Don't just be like those leftists and liberals who want to win every argument by deploying another policy paper or one more Pew poll.
Well, what's interesting, when I watched the 2016 debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, all of the people I was watching them with who hated Donald Trump were saying, oh, look what a terrible debater he is. She's wiping the floor with him because, her arguments make sense. His arguments don't.
Yeah.
I wonder if you kind of share my perspective that actually Donald Trump is quite effective.
Yes.
Rhetorically.
Sadly, 100% he is.
He's
not
good.
In the sense that he's an eloquent person. No, he's not. Not in the sense he's an ignoramus. He rambles. He says ridiculous things. Don't set me off on Donald Trump and my critique of Trump. But does he understand, like a lot of fascists and authoritarians have understood throughout history, how to get people worked up, how to manipulate, how to demagogue? Yes, of course. He's very good at that. He understands the role of emotion. He understands that when he says build a wall, ban Muslims, lock her up, the impact that has on a crowd, on a rally, in a way that Hillary Clinton talking about a 17-point childcare proposal doesn't. And one thing I'd say about Hillary is Interestingly, if you remember 2008, go back a previous 8 years, she's running against Obama. She loses in Iowa, and people think she's out once she loses in New Hampshire. And she has a really emotional conversation with a voter in a diner, if memory serves me correct. She cries, and she wins in New Hampshire. Now, I know correlation is not causation, but I find it interesting that the time we see an emotional, human Hillary, that's when she wins.
Mm-hmm. There are some on the left who think that debate's not worth it. I think you and I both disagree with that. But another thing that I think is worth deflating is the idea that just because you're right, you're going to win. I think people underestimate how good I mentioned Joe Bolton being a slippery customer. You just said there about Donald Trump being effective. Someone like Douglas Murray,
yes.
You might go in thinking that because their beliefs, because Douglas Murray says all this like horrible white nationalist stuff, you're going to bowl him over because these are terrible, idiotic beliefs. But then actually, these people are very eloquent. They're good. They know what they're doing.
I agree with you 110%. I think one of the reasons so many people, leftists, liberals, progressives, people who support the Palestinian cause, Muslims who are trying to fight back against Islamophobia, why so many of these groups lose in public debates is because it's an assumption of, well, we are morally correct. We are factually correct. Therefore, we will win. And I'm trying to say in the book that just having the facts, just being on the right side is not enough. Clearly, that's been demonstrated to us time and time again. There's a lot of confirmation bias, as I talk about in the book. Especially in an age of social media, we cluster in our own groups, in our own information silos, in our own social media circles. And then we say, hey, we've got all the best arguments. How can we lose? I remember when Brexit happened, the number of people who said, hold on.
But it's stupid.
After Brexit happened, everyone I know is against it. Well, everyone you know is your social media feed. And what were the arguments for it? And, Brexit's a classic example where the right and the Brexiteers were able to talk about sovereignty, freedom, liberty, British tradition, get people really worked up emotionally, talk about abstract concepts and values. Meanwhile, the Remain side, the anti-Brexit side, was talking about, here are the costs of trade. Here's what it'll cost to change our trade deal with the EU. Very uninspiring technical stuff. Progressives, liberals have always been a little bit too technocratic, managerial, bureaucratic for my liking. I want to see a bit more energy and passion. So, there's a famous story that I think it's Plato or Aristotle, I can't remember who writes it, about the rhetorician and the doctor. If they were to go city to city, giving out medical advice, who would the people listen to? They'd listen to the rhetorician, not the doctor. Because the doctor may have the actual qualifications.
We just had a few years of proof of that.
Exactly. But can the doctor convince the public? No, the rhetorician can, because they have the skill set. They have the tricks. So that's how dangerous rhetoric can be. That's how invaluable rhetoric can be. And you're right, to go back to your earlier question, in the wrong hands, it can be used for all sorts of horrible things. Incitement of violence, for example.
Yeah.
But in the right hands, you get a MLK, you get a Churchill in World War II.
Yeah, right. So on things like climate and on COVID, you have this failure to understand that just because you're right on the fact, you still have this task of getting the public messaging right, getting the rhetoric right. Going to battle with bad ideas is not just a matter of proving them
wrong. 100%. And I think COVID's another example of that. You have the right, you have the conspiracy theorists pushing freedom, liberty, and you have the other side saying, have you checked my latest peer-reviewed paper on masking? It's just not a fair fight.
Yeah. And, you mentioned Brexit. I mean, Boris Johnson's entire career is a testimony to the fact that, humor, personality can be everything, right? I mean, he spread nonsense about Brexit. People, the statistics about how much we'd get for the NHS if we pulled out of Europe are all false. But that's not what mattered. People like Boris Johnson because he's funny, or they did like him back when they liked him.
Humor. I have an entire chapter on the importance of humor.
Yeah.
Again, a lot of people on the left tend to be super serious and super rational. And I'm saying, no, you need some emotion. You need some humor. It's the best way to bond with an audience. It's the best way to come across as relatable, as human, as authentic. Again, people will bond with you, not just with your arguments. They will connect with the person, not just with the argument that the person is making. That is the real world, not the world of kind of abstract theory or of Athenian debate. And also, I would say this about Boris Johnson. On the eve of when he came out for Brexit, did you know, Nathan, he wrote 2 op-eds the night before? One making the case for Brexit, the other making the case against, because he couldn't decide what would be in the best interest of his political career. He didn't give a damn about the country, but what would help him. And eventually he decided that Brexit would help his career, so he came out with Brexit. But what's interesting is, you really want to go down the cynical road. There is the power of argument and debate that Boris Johnson, old Etonian, Oxford Union guy, super confident, is able to make the argument for both sides of the same issue and cynically pick the one that helps him.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've been talking about rhetoric, humor, these things, even ad hominem arguments, and the utility of these things and why we need to use them for good. In fact, having the facts, and we've been saying just having the facts is not effective in and of itself, but having the facts can be used as part of an effective strategy. In fact, two of the chapters in your book are about having the facts. There's the show your receipts and the do your homework chapter that are all about the way that in these interviews where you have managed to expose people, it is because of a wealth of factual preparation going in.
100%. I mean, I've been talking a lot on the book tour about the importance of emotion because I do believe that's one of the main takeaways from the book, that we don't understand how the role of feelings when it comes to winning people over, persuading, overcoming skepticism, the fact that we feel our way towards the decision. I produce a bunch of science in that chapter, which talks about how the brain works. But having said that, I make it very clear, I'm not saying to drop facts for feelings. I'm saying they're both important. In fact, feelings gets you through the door, and then you have to show your facts, show your receipts. As you say, I've got 2 chapters in there on the subject. I'm known as the guy who brings receipts. I take great pride in the fact that when I argue with people like John Bolton, and I say to John Bolton, hey, do you support regime change in Iran because you believe in democracy or because you're getting paid to give speeches to an anti-Iranian government cult? And he says, well, I didn't do that. I did it after Hillary Clinton delisted them from the terrorist group. And I say, no, you did it in 2010 before they delisted. I've got the transcript here of you in Paris. That's me bringing my receipts. That is me having my facts ready to go, having done my homework, having anticipated what he's going to say, and being ready with the comeback, with the pushback, with the follow-up. So, yes, I do say very strongly, if you are going to win an argument, one of the best ways to win an argument is to know your opponent's side of the argument as well as your own. In fact, to know your opponent's side of the argument better than they do. Steelman their argument. We live in an age where we strawman each other's arguments, especially on social media. I'm saying, no, steelman it. Argue against the strongest version of what you think your opponent's argument will be on the night so that you're ready for anything.
Yeah. You say the book, with one of your head-to-head debates with a defender, I can't remember if he was actually a representative of the Israeli government or one of the settlers, you had someone on your staff kind of play him beforehand. You game it all out so that every answer they could give in response to a question that you ask.
So I used to be a researcher, and I talk about this in the book, on ITV weekend programming. ITV is the British equivalent of NBC fundamentally. And the Sunday morning shows at ITV, going back to the early 80s, were well known for having a kind of plan of attack where everything would be worked out in advance. If the minister says X, you say Y. If they say Y, you say Z, etc. And it would just follow. It would all be plotted out and practiced in the days and months. Really, really rigorous approach to interviewing. So I've taken that with me through my life, and I've taken it to the next level. When I was at Al Jazeera, as you mentioned, where we had more time, we would, for a big interview that was coming up, and in this case, Danny Ayalon, the former Israeli, I think, deputy foreign minister, came on the show in the Oxford Union in front of a live crowd. Yeah, I wanted to role play. I didn't just want to imagine if he says this. I got one of my producers to become Danny Ayalon, to read every Danny Ayalon interview, to read every Danny Ayalon op-ed, and to basically put themselves inside Danny Ayalon's head so that we could role play. So I could say, hey, Danny Ayalon, what about this UN resolution? And know, okay, here's what he's going to say in response. Do I have a response to his response? Right. So it requires a lot of preparation. People think we're winging this stuff. We're just turning up and just chucking stuff out. No, I like to do a lot of planning and prep. It annoys me that people think they can stand up to speak in front of a crowd. People think they can engage in a debate or do an interview without doing the sufficient homework. And one of the chapters in the book is do your homework.
Yeah.
Doctors don't go in to do an operation without being fully prepared for it. In every walk of life, people practice, prepare, do the homework. I don't see why when it comes to public speaking or performing in public, arguing in public, we think we can just wing it. That just annoys me.
Well, that moment with Eric Prince that you had that everyone watched and that sparked the investigation, right, has nothing to do with rhetoric and everything to do with the fact that when you ask him, why didn't you cite this meeting in your congressional testimony? And I forget what he said, but he denied.
Well, first he says, I did cite it. And I said,
I did cite it. And then you have the testimony.
I have the transcript. We printed it out. Here it is. Here's your congressional. And we went through every page of it. And it's not there.
Yeah. And then what could he say?
The receipts. Have the receipts in your hand. You can't go wrong.
Here, look through it yourself. Right? So that's really important. I was interested in what you said earlier about, interviewing climate change deniers or election deniers or QAnon people, because I think I might differ from you on this, because part of me really, really wants to see you go after Dinesh D'Souza. I want to see someone sit down with that man.
Part of me does too, Nathan. I'll be honest with you. Part of me does as well, but I have to balance out.
Go through that stupid book of
I have
his.
to balance out the damage done by that, because it's not a consequence-free thing. I've learned this through experience, Nathan. About 10 years ago, I interviewed Richard Lindzen, who's an MIT emeritus professor, and he's a climate change skeptic. And he's one of the only climate change skeptics who's actually from the field, who's actually published in the field. So I thought, okay, we'll have him on. He's not nuts like everyone else. He's actually got some scientific qualifications. Let's have him on. And people said to me, don't do it. You're going to regret it. You can't have a climate change denier on. It's going to be a car crash. And it was a car crash. Because when you debate with a conspiracy theorist, Nathan, everything becomes part of the conspiracy theory. There are no rules. There is no rationality. It's pinning Jello to a wall. And after that, I thought to myself, I'm not doing that again. I just gave that person a platform to misinform my viewers for the course of an hour. And I wasn't able to pin him down, not because I'm not good at pinning people down, but because it's almost impossible to pin down a conspiracy theorist, because they're not operating in the same reality-based universe as the rest of us. If I had Marjorie Taylor Greene on my show, Nathan, it would be fun. I would enjoy battering her on the nonsense she says and the inherent contradictions of what she says. I could craft the interview for you now.
Okay.
But I would also be giving a platform not just to someone who spreads horrible white supremacy, which in itself I find offensive to even platform such offensive, odious people, but also she doesn't believe anything she's saying. It's not a good faith argument. I'm almost insulting the...
I don't know. Does she not believe it?
You think she believes half the stuff she says after all the Fox Dominion text? You don't think she's saying a lot of what she needs to be said to? I think these people have contempt for their base. I don't want to insult my own viewers by allowing these people on. Many of these people on the right are grifters. They are as much out for the money as they are for the kind of eyeballs and conspiracies. And where would you start an election denial debate?
Sure.
It's almost insulting to people to say, okay, I'm going to indulge your cynically nonsensical point that Joe Biden didn't win the election.
Well, okay, but D'Souza, for example, he wrote a book and he says he has evidence. He says, I've compiled evidence.
But we know he doesn't.
Well, I know. So you say, let's hear the evidence. Okay, well, the evidence doesn't prove what you say it proves, does it?
And I'm not saying it wouldn't be easy to do that. It's in some ways shooting fish in a barrel, in some ways harder, because, as I say, conspiracy theorists can fold everything into the conspiracy. But the problem is, at the end of that 10, 15 minutes, what has been achieved? He hasn't changed his mind, which is fine. I don't try and change guests' mind. But what has the audience learned or experienced? Because my worry is if even one person, this comes back to the Gish Gallop point. The Gish Galloper doesn't want you to believe them over you. They want you to believe no one. These people are not interested in fact-based discourse. They're interested in burning the whole thing down. They want to destroy a free exchange of ideas. That's how fascism grows, right? That's how authoritarianism comes to power. When you don't believe anyone, nihilism is a step before fascism. And I'm thinking to myself, why do I want to aid and abet people who want to burn it all down? Cynically.
Well, I don't know that you would be aiding and abetting, because I feel like one of the things they do is say, well, they won't engage our arguments, they won't examine our evidence, and that's because they're afraid.
No, you can engage it. You can engage. I mean, Philip Rucker, or, not Philip Rucker, sorry, who's the other person at the Washington Post? I'm having a mind block. You can do a fact check. You can say, here's Dinesh D'Souza's book, here's everything that's wrong with it, without giving the man a platform to gaslight, Gish Gallop, and lie.
Yeah, it is tough to know what you should engage with. Yeah.
It is tough. I'm not saying it's easy. It's tough, especially in a two-party system where one of the two parties has now been taken over by authoritarians and gaslighters. And I have a hygiene test on my show, Nathan, where I say I won't have election deniers on. And I wondered to myself, and my team, we discussed this, how long can we sustain that rule? Because we're heading into 2024. If everyone on the right is an election denier, then you're basically saying I won't have anyone right-wing on my show, which I'm not comfortable doing because I don't want to have just people who agree with me.
Right.
So maybe I'll have to drop my hygiene rule at some point, but it's not something I'll do happily.
But part of me just wants to see you go like, prove it. Prove it. I want the proof. Show me the proof.
Part of me wants to do that too, but it's a balancing act. How much oxygen you give these people to a point where they just win by appearing, right? That's my worry. It's a real issue. I can say to Marjorie Taylor Greene, hey, you think the election was stolen in Georgia, the election that elected you. So you're not a member of Congress. That would be my obvious gambit with Marjorie. I've never heard anyone really push her on that.
Yeah.
If Joe Biden didn't win Georgia, you didn't win Georgia. But where would we go then?
Oh, I'd have her on. You might not talk to. I'd talk to Marjorie Taylor Greene, but maybe I might be wrong. I might come out of there like you did with the climate change thing, where you're like, shit, that didn't work. That just
You really have to stop and ask, at what point is it just, for their side, all publicity is good publicity? Quick question, Nathan. Quick question. I'll have to ask you a question because I can't help myself.
Sure.
Where do you draw the line? Do you have no line?
I don't know if I do draw I would draw
the Holocaust denier. You would debate the Holocaust on your show.
Yes. Yeah, I think so.
What would be the point of that?
I think to show the audience, to discredit the person.
The audience knows that. The only people who are Holocaust deniers are crazy conspiracy theorists.
Well, okay. Actually, no. I tell you when I would debate a Holocaust denial. If Holocaust denial was getting extremely popular, right? I think that right now it's, hardly anyone.
Yeah, which is basically a version of what I just said, which is at some point maybe I have to drop my election denier block because it's so widespread. It's now the accepted wisdom on the right, so I can't make that my... Yeah, and it's horrible. I hate to have to do that.
Yeah, the election deniers are getting more marginal, though, so there's no need to engage them, right?
Sorry, who's getting more marginal?
The election deniers right now are getting more marginal,
are they?
Right?
As far as I'm aware, the Republican Party is all election denial.
In the last election, in the midterms, they all lost, right?
They lost, but the Republican Party has not stopped believing in election denial, right?
So, climate change denial, the more popular it gets, the more I think we need to do, working on exposing. I would not have a Holocaust denier on if I didn't think I could really, if I thought it was going to go like the Richard whatever interview.
Yeah, and if it's not gratuitous as well. Lots of people, also Nathan, a lot of people just want to have arguments for clicks, even if it's damaging to our discourse, and that's the problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
You got to be careful. You got to be real careful. But I do think argument can be very effective. Let me close here by just asking you, there's a YouTube video of you that's got millions of views from about 10 years ago of a debate you did at Oxford on whether Islam was a peaceful religion.
Yes.
You gave this 10-minute speech that really, really resonated with people, where you defended against all these people saying Islam is a religion of violence. What do you think it was about that speech that was so particularly effective?
It's a great question. Yeah, it was 10 years ago this May. It was on the day after a terrorist attack in London. So I thought, we're definitely going to lose this debate. How can I make the case for Islam being peaceful when one soldier was just killed by two quote unquote Islamists? I guess it was because I threw everything I had into it. It was emotional. I made it very personal. I talk about in the book about the importance of personal anecdote. I talked about me and my kids and what this meant for my parents to pass a motion that said Islam was a religion of violence. What does that say about your Muslim neighbors? So I did make it emotional and personal. I did turn up with receipts. I had the facts that shut them down. I had the polling. I had the evidence about terrorism and terrorist attacks. I went ad hominem. I questioned the credibility and expertise of my three opponents in a very successful way. And I had my zingers. I had my one-liners, as I say in the book. I pointed out that if Osama bin Laden had turned up to that debate, he would be on the other side. He would be arguing the case that Islam's a violent religion. So I had a bunch of different techniques that I deploy in the book, all rolled into one. But I was very passionate. The audience at home knew I cared, knew that it meant a lot to me, and knew that I had done my homework and turned up ready to make that case. I also think it helped from a Muslim perspective in terms of going viral at Separated Vote that night, which we won in the Oxford Union. But the reason it went globally viral is I think for a lot of Muslims, it was the first time they'd seen a brown Muslim dude in black tie in the heart of the British establishment, rhetorically giving the anti-Islam elites a bit of a kicking.
Yeah, it feels nice for those who are used to being on the receiving end of things to get to win. And that's the other nice thing is if you use this on behalf of the marginalized and oppressed,
yes,
you take back power, and it feels good. It feels
very
good.
Much so.
Mehdi Hasan, the book is Win Every Argument, the Art of Debating, Persuading, and Public Speaking, available now. Thank you for coming on Current Affairs today.
Thanks for having me. It was fun. Appreciate it.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.